Something that I used to always look forward to in the world of gaming were video game showcases, specifically E3. Back when that was around, it always felt like it was the best time of the year to be a gamer, with all of the major studios coming out and revealing new games in a way that was designed to build up insane amounts of hype. But with the gradual death of E3 ever since 2020, things have become a lot more decentralized. Each company might hold their own digital event from time to time, and while some of them are really good, they're often hit or miss, and I've noticed a sharp decline in quality among them overall in the past few years. And beyond simply weakening a lot of the excitement that I and many others once had for new releases, this decline is indicative of a lot of the problems with the modern gaming industry. So today, let's take a trek through the rise and fall of video game showcases, what it tells us about the modern games industry, and what we do in the future. Our story begins in the Dark Ages, aka the early 90s. This was a wild time before the advent of E3 even existed, and the gaming space was being completely and wildly transformed. You see, after the rivalry between the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis drove interest in the console wars higher than ever before, and thus led to record-breaking sales for both consoles, the next generation promised to be even more a harbinger of upheaval. In almost perfect unison, the 3D era of gaming and E3 began, with the event initially being an unexciting series of press conferences rather than a massive spectacle. Game reveals before this point weren't really a big deal either. You just open Nintendo Power to find out something was on its way, or hell, just see it on the shelves after it had already released. The lack of internet meant a lot of people had no idea what was coming out and didn't stay up to date with gaming news. In fact, gaming news wasn't really a thing back then, which may sound really unfortunate, but it also means no gaming journalists. Oh, everyone, shh. Just please, let me stay in this fantasy a little bit longer. Okay. Back to reality. So when the first E3 happened, it was purely for the actual press, without really any showmanship. That was until Sega attempted a plot twist. You see, after launching themselves into the number 2 spot in all of gaming and taking on the Goliath that was Nintendo, Sega was preparing to release their 3D system, the Saturn. But instead of releasing it when they had originally planned, they pushed it out with very few games right then and there, which shocked most developers and retailers. It was a baffling move that wasn't helped by the $400 price tag, so when Sony, the newcomer and underdog to the gaming space, were introducing the world to PlayStation, they turned what was meant to be another long, boring speech into a simple, yet badass maneuver.
$299.
And with that, the concept of winning E3 was born. Now, for a lot of those earlier years, it was still somewhat low-key and uninteresting, but gradually as the industry grew, with PlayStation overtaking Nintendo by a huge margin, and the juggernaut of Microsoft joining the competition, things heated up. The next slew of new consoles, the PS2, Dreamcast, Xbox, and GameCube, got a lot more fanfare when revealed, with the GameCube being particularly exciting, until its bizarre proprietary mini-discs were shown off, which basically solidified that the PS2 would wipe the floor with it on account of its DVD playing capabilities. But despite Nintendo's really poor sales that generation, falling behind both Xbox and PlayStation, they ended up being responsible for the first true E3 highlight. The $299 line was cold and unforgettable, but this game reveal is when E3 was truly born. You see, after the last Zelda game, The Wind Waker, had disappointed fans due to its cartoony style, Nintendo decided to give fans the dark, mature, next-gen Zelda they had been wanting. Nowadays, both Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are dearly beloved by nearly everyone, but back then, this was a huge deal. In an era of Lord of the Rings and just a few years before The Elder Scrolls 4, this is how Nintendo's audience reacted to Twilight Princess finally being announced.
But before you leave, I'd like you to step inside one more world for Nintendo GameCube.
That is still one of the craziest reactions ever, and as you can probably understand, every company wanted a piece of that excitement after that. Now, granted, not all of them succeeded.
I'd say I was speechless, but I have one more thing to announce. Coming this year, Peggle 2!
But it did make things more exciting when everyone was trying to get attention by being outrageous and building a bunch of hype. Reveals like Killzone 2 had to resort to a completely fabricated CGI trailer that was hilariously passed off as gameplay. Now, to be fair, the actual game ended up still looking fantastic and impressive, but they knew they were misleading people for extra attention. Ironically, Microsoft did the same thing with Halo 2, which honestly feels quite unnecessary. I mean, it's a sequel to Halo, not Killzone, so I think it'd be easier to get people on board without lying to them. For years, the Big Three and other third-party publishers stole the show with big announcements, but the hype surrounding them was actually justifiable, as games like BioShock Infinite, Batman Arkham City, Metal Gear Solid 2, and countless others did something shocking. They actually ended up being good. This was not an era of mass player deception, and even the games that did kinda lie to your face, like Killzone 2, still ended up being pretty damn good. I know it seems like a foreign concept today, but back then it was sort of a tradition to release a game and have it actually be good and functional. I know, right? And we could spend hours going over the best, funniest, weirdest moments throughout countless years of E3, from the very first words of Nintendo's Reggie to that bizarre Bethesda conference that felt like the audience had broken out of Arkham Asylum and forced the presenters to hold a show for them.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Wow. Thank you. Yeah!
But what I want to focus on are three events that I think show the gradual downfall of gaming showcases, all of which happen to be from Sony and are just a few years apart from one another. The first one is PlayStation's E3 2016 conference, which might legitimately be the greatest video game showcase of all time. For context, Sony started out this generation on a wave of public support as Nintendo was doing
hot button popcorn, that's a deal.
Things, and Xbox had shown a grab bag of anti-consumer practices at the release of their latest console, which gave Sony a golden opportunity to $2.99 their asses real hard.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation. He's already dead.
That was badass, but after all of the support Sony had had, they really started to disappoint their fans after the first 2 years. I guess they pulled an Obama. Releasing games like Knack, Killzone Shadowfall, and The Order 1886 didn't exactly inspire confidence, so come 2016, they really needed to prove themselves, and holy shit, that's exactly what they did. PlayStation VR, Crash Bandicoot Remaster, Insomniac Spider-Man, Death Stranding, Detroit Become Human, The Last Guardian, Horizon Zero Dawn, Days Gone, God of fucking War, all in one show. They basically pulled out all the stops, showing the whole rest of the generation, and every single game looked fantastic. It was where they regained interest and showed their incredible commitment to advancing gaming as an art form, and that same year we saw fantastic releases from them like Uncharted 4 and Ratchet & Clank. But after 4 years, with them having released all of those great games and Death Stranding, Sony was doing incredibly well. They had received acclaim, tons of money, and even some Game of the Year awards. So what was next? Well, 2020 rolls around and it's time for the next generation of gaming, so they have to somehow get people to invest in their $500 really weird looking console with very similar hardware to the PS4. So what do? Well, interestingly enough, they focused on a lot of third-party games, some of which were very lame, but a lot of which looked interesting and ended up being fantastic, like Kena Bridge of Spirits, Bugsnax, Ghostwire Tokyo, and Resident Evil Village. But the announcements of Spider-Man Miles Morales and Horizon Forbidden West sold the system very well. It was a showcase that demonstrated an ability to deliver even under the circumstances of COVID and after having released bangers for years. And just 3 months later, they dropped another show with hits like Final Fantasy XVI, the Demon's Souls remake, and God of War Ragnarok. So in 2016, they brought the house down, and in 2020, they showed they were going to keep delivering quality. And hell, even in 2021, we got another solid show with announcements like Wolverine and Spider-Man 2, but then, all of a sudden, radio silence. We went from September 2021 to May 2023 without a showcase, and even though during all that, releases like the sequels to God of War and Horizon kept the PS5 relevant, the lack of new information was concerning, and criticisms of the PS5's lackluster lineup were mounting. So here we are at another inflection point in 2023 with a need for them to knock it out of the park. And what did we get? So after a year and a half of no showcases and not even knowing what the majority of Sony studios were doing with all of their time and all the money that Sony spent to even acquire them, that was part of the showcase. I think that tells you how it went. I think that tells you everything you need to know. It wasn't all bad, and there were some promising third-party games, but the initial disappointment shared by many fans after the showcase ballooned into fury in the coming years as Sony revealed their gross plans to turn away from the single-player experiences that had made them respected and unique, and instead wanted to chase the infinite money dragon of multiplayer live service games. Naughty Dog wasted years and probably hundreds of millions of dollars on a Last of Us Online game only for it to be cancelled, and then Concord also happened, being the biggest financial failure in gaming history. Sony had shown a willingness to betray their fans, and that was apparent in their studio's relative silence, which continues to this day. Hell, I'm still waiting for something that reminds me of that 2016 showcase, but unfortunately, I'm doubtful. Although the juxtaposition of Concord's immense failure and Astrobot's insane success with it even winning Game of the Year might hopefully make them realize that they're going down the wrong path. And similar problems can be found with Microsoft, who have a history of promising a ton and delivering next to nothing. Every year at their showcase, which at least is a consistent and reliable thing unlike Sony's, they seem to make some boastful claim about breaking the record for the number of games they're showing, not realizing that the quality is what's actually relevant. And even when they have a great show like they did in 2024, focusing on a smaller group of incredibly compelling games like Doom the Dark Ages, Perfect Dark, and the new Gears of War, they end up screwing it up down the line anyway. The problem with these two companies is that while Sony almost always does deliver high-quality experiences when they do release games, they take way too long between them nowadays because they've bloated their studios with a bunch of live service garbage that no one wants and excessively trying to make every game look amazing when that's not always necessary. Meanwhile, Microsoft promises a ton of great stuff and then struggles to deliver on quality or on even releasing the fucking game 90% of the time. It's actually depressing, man. Halo Infinite was a letdown for many, as was Starfield, which were their two flagship titles. Games like Avowed and Hellblade 2 were met with decent reviews, but basically flew under the radar because they weren't marketed at all. Games like Redfall got attention, but only because they were so fucking awful, and even when they do have a rare hit, you know what they do? Microsoft, according to many the most pro-consumer of the big three, shuts down the studio responsible for its most beloved exclusive since Cuphead, Hi-Fi Rush, literally right after saying the world needs more games like it, and then likewise shuts down Everwild and Perfect Dark after years of development and hype. Either they're overpromising from the start, or their studios are such incompetent messes that they can't get a halfway decent game out the door after 5 to 10 years in development and hundreds of millions of dollars. Or, you know, the most likely option, which is that Microsoft executives are such greedy assholes that they'll screw over any game that gets in the way of their bottom line. But, and not to play favorites, I will give Nintendo credit for actually managing to be competent on both fronts. Their games are as excellent for the most part as they always have been, and they do build up lots of hype when releasing them, giving even more niche series like Pikmin or Metroid a chance to succeed. And while, as I've explained, the three all have their own strengths and weaknesses, I feel we're a long ways away from when gaming felt like one big competition of quality. Sure, shitty games have always existed, but gaming now feels more soulless and greedy than it has for a long time. Competition between the big three has sort of vanished, since Xbox are too lobotomized to actually stand a chance, and Sony and Nintendo go after almost entirely separate audiences, meaning they've all gotten complacent where they are, not feeling the need to pull a $2.99 or a used games video. They don't need to be extra nice to the consumer to screw over their competitor because their competitor is too busy shooting themselves in the foot and eating fucking glue. And ultimately, until we can jolt these companies awake and make them realize that their job is to create great gaming experiences rather than to cut their CEOs a bigger bonus check every year, things are just gonna get worse. We're not gonna get more games like Concord because of wokeness, but because of out-of-touch studio heads who see games more as a product than as the art form that they actually are. And that is why the big three have lost so much trust, while indie developers have gained respect and admiration over the past few years. Beautiful games like Celeste and Undertale left lasting impressions on millions with pixel art and a $20 price tag, so we should be expecting way more from billion-dollar companies with advanced tech and graphics. They should be doing a whole lot better because we deserve a whole lot better. I want games from all publishers to be high quality again. I want gaming to feel more like a fun hobby than a dirty, greed-fueled business again. And you know what? I want new game reveals to be shrouded in justified hype rather than cautious and uneasy excitement. I'm sick of having to dilute my excitement with negativity over and over again because I don't know if it's going to be another disappointment. And the only way we can stop that horrible feeling from plaguing the gaming community is by having these developers regain our trust. And you know how they do that? Hint, by releasing some good games for once. Will they? Well, only time will tell, but it's good that we can look back on this more innocent era of E3, of game hype that was actually justified, the Xbox 360, the PS3, the Wii. I know I sound like just another nostalgic guy harping for the past, but it is a powerful tool to be aware of an era in which things were more just and less greedy, because it tells you that it is possible to make things like that once again. And we will.
The stages of the game will also be based on famous battles which actually took place in ancient Japan. So here's this giant enemy crab.